Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, let me first associate myself with the remarks of the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Lewis, who paid the price for this Voting Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. He paid beyond measure. He sacrificed beyond measure to make this a reality for every American. This near-midnight attack is an unprecedented attack on the implementation legislation of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. It took this Congress 95 years from the moment that the 15th Amendment was added to the Constitution of the United States for this Congress to wake up after Selma to Montgomery to pass legislation to implement the Voting Rights Act. For me to stand here and listen to my distinguished colleague, the distinguished gentleman from Virginia, the chairman of the subcommittee, for him to argue that there may be a time, and we may be approaching a time, when the Voting Rights Act preclearance provision of Section 5 is no longer necessary, couldn't be further from the truth. Here's how the state legislative process works within most state legislatures. First, whoever's in the political majority, Democrat or Republican, usually draws legislative lines consistent with their political advantage, whether it's the Democratic Party or whether it is the Republican Party. Such is the case in Illinois, such is the case of every state in the Union. Almost never before the 1965 Voting Rights Act had racial minorities or language minorities ever been considered as a factor in the ongoing partisan debate for the last 150 years between Democrats and Republicans. Only the Voting Rights Act of 1965 says that if a language minority or a racial minority in a protected jurisdiction can draw a congressional district, or can draw a state representative district, or can draw a state senatorial district, to give a racial minority an opportunity to represent their own people in a legislative body, the state legislative body must take that into account. And for us to be standing here on the floor of the Congress arguing about the right to vote, we're not discussing at that level the right to vote. We're discussing whether or not legislators will be effective in representing their constituents by protecting Section 5, the preclearance provision, because most of us can't go to our governors or our state legislatures to protect the franchise for minorities. I know that the 1st Congressional District, the 2nd Congressional District, the 7th Congressional District, the 4th Congressional District of Illinois are all Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act congressional districts. From Virginia around to Texas, because we still cannot trust Democrats, because we still cannot trust Republicans in Virginia, all the way around to Texas, to consider racial minorities in the drawing of congressional districts. Sure, those states must implement their plans by submitting their plans to the federal government for preclearance. Look at the language minorities. Look at what's taking place in Texas. Look at what's taking place in New Mexico. New Mexico, a state 25% Latino. And the state legislature played games with what constitutes an effective congressional district that might give a Latino an opportunity to represent a congressional district in Congress. It plays both sides against the middle. Both Democrats and Republicans through history, Mr. Speaker, have used race as a partisan advantage in trying to draw congressional districts and legislative districts. I appeal to you, Mr. Speaker, to reject this amendment at midnight, reject this unconstitutional, unprecedented attack on the civil rights of every American, reject efforts to undermine the implementation legislation of the 15th Amendment, earned through an American Civil War along with number 13, 14, and 15, reject this effort to roll back the civil rights gains of 1965 by undermining the funding and the federal government's capacity to ensure that minorities have a chance to represent themselves in the Congress of the United States. Reject this effort on this evening. Both Democrat and Republican should reject it in a bipartisan manner. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I know the gentleman is going to strike the last word with his own time, but I want to give him the last minute I have in addition to striking the last word on his own time. Is the gentleman okay? Mr. Lewis, would you like to add something else? Mr. Speaker, I return the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time.